The mansion at the top of Silverhill stood like a crown above the city, tall, cold, and glittering. Its marble floors had never known the touch of dirt, its chandeliers never flickered. Every inch screamed wealth, success, and distance. Inside lived Alexander Cross, one of the youngest self-made millionaires in the country. People called him a genius. They said he built his empire with brilliance and steel, with numbers and logic, but not a drop of warmth. The only thing Alexander had ever loved more than business was his wife, Amelia. And when she passed away while giving birth to their son, Ethan, something inside Alexander froze. He still walked, talked, and worked, but his eyes turned hollow. His mansion became a graveyard of silence, and his son, the baby who should have been his joy, became his living reminder of loss. Ethan was only 1 year old when the rumors began. The staff whispered that something was wrong with him, that he was impossible to handle. The boy kicked, screamed, and bit anyone who came close. No nanny lasted more than a week. He would fling toys across the room, punch faces, and shriek with a rage too big for his tiny body. But he wasn't evil. He was broken. The nurses said he missed his mother's warmth, the softness of a heart that had been taken too soon. But Alexander didn't want to hear it. "I pay for the best," he'd say coldly, signing checks and turning away. "Find someone who can do their job." One by one, nannies arrived, smiling, patient, hopeful. And one by one, they left in tears, clutching their bruises and resignation letters. The child didn't let anyone hold him. He didn't let anyone near him. Until the day Grace Daniels walked through the gates. Grace wasn't like the others. She wasn't hired to care for the baby. She worked nights, mopping marble floors and polishing stair rails. Her job was simple: clean quietly and leave before the morning light touched the windows. But Grace had something the mansion hadn't seen in years, a heart that refused to harden. Her laughter followed her like a melody. She hummed while she worked, whispered little prayers under her breath, and always spoke kindly, even to the other cleaners who rarely smiled back. She had seen enough of life's unfairness to understand that kindness was a rebellion all its own. One night, around midnight, Grace heard a sound, a wailing cry echoing down the hall. It wasn't the sharp, spoiled cry of a baby demanding attention. It was something deeper. Something lonely. She froze with her mop halfway in the bucket. The other cleaners had told her not to go near the nursery. "That's the demon child," they warned, half joking. "He'll scratch your face off if you get too close." But Grace's heart wouldn't let her walk away. She followed the sound up the staircase, past the portraits of cold-eyed ancestors. The door to the nursery was slightly open. Inside, moonlight spilled across the floor, silvering the toys and the crib. And there, standing on unsteady legs, was little Ethan, his face red, fists clenched, eyes wild with fear. Grace stepped inside, slowly. "Hey now," she whispered softly, "it's all right, baby." The moment Ethan saw her, he screamed. He threw a toy car at her face. It missed, clattering against the door. Grace didn't flinch. She knelt down, keeping her distance, her voice calm as still water. "You don't have to be scared. I won't hurt you." The baby glared, trembling, chest heaving. His eyes darted toward the door, expecting her to leave like all the others. But Grace stayed. Minute after minute, she stayed, just sitting there on the floor, humming a gentle tune her grandmother used to sing. It was the strangest thing. Slowly, the boy's breathing began to match the rhythm of her hum. His fists unclenched. His tiny legs wobbled, and then, hesitantly, he crawled toward her. Grace didn't move. She let him come closer at his own pace. And then, to her surprise, Ethan reached out his hand, tiny, shaking, and touched her cheek. The next moment, he leaned forward and pressed his lips against her skin. A soft, clumsy baby kiss. Grace's eyes filled with tears. She smiled and whispered, "There you go, little man. You're safe." From that night, everything began to change. The next morning, when Alexander came to check the nursery, he froze. His son wasn't screaming. He wasn't thrashing. He was asleep, peacefully, for the first time in months. Grace sat on the floor beside him, head resting against the crib, fast asleep with the mop still leaning nearby. Alexander frowned. "Who are you?" he demanded when she woke. Grace shot up, startled. I'm the cleaner, sir. I was just. You were just what? Sleeping in my son's room. I'm sorry, she stammered. He was crying. I only wanted to help. Alexander was ready to fire her on the spot. But then he looked down, and saw Ethan's tiny hand clutching a piece of Grace's uniform sleeve, even in sleep. The baby's face, once twisted in constant anger, was calm. Peaceful. Alexander's throat tightened, though he didn't understand why. He turned sharply away. You may go. That should have been the end of it. But that night, Ethan cried again, and Grace, though she wasn't supposed to, went back. And again the next night. And the next. Soon, the baby who once struck and screamed began to laugh when he saw her. The mansion's halls, long haunted by grief, began to echo with giggles again. The staff noticed. So did Alexander. He didn't know whether to be grateful or angry. He couldn't understand how a simple cleaner could reach his son when all the trained professionals had failed. But Grace didn't care about pride or power. She only cared about the boy who had lost his mother's touch, and the father who had lost his heart. Then one morning, everything changed. Alexander entered the nursery early, only to find Grace holding Ethan, rocking him as she hummed. The sight made something burn inside him, something raw. He barked, "Put him down." Grace froze, startled. The baby whimpered. "I said put him down." Alexander thundered, storming closer. "You're not paid to touch my son." Grace set Ethan back in his crib, eyes filled with both apology and quiet strength. "I'm sorry, sir. But your son was crying. I couldn't just." "You think you know better than me?" Alexander snapped. "You think you can walk in here, a cleaner, and act like you belong?" Her hands shook, but her voice didn't. "No, sir. I just think love doesn't need permission." The silence that followed was heavy. Ethan began to cry again, reaching out toward Grace, his tiny fingers clutching the air. And for the first time, Alexander saw it clearly, the truth. His son wasn't broken. He was just unloved. And somehow, this woman had given him what all his money never could. He didn't say a word as Grace turned to leave, her eyes glistening. But that night, as he stood in his study staring at the city lights, Alexander replayed her words again and again. Love doesn't need permission. The mansion had changed. For months, it had been a museum of silence, rooms too large for comfort, tables too long for a single man, and walls that swallowed sound whole. But since Grace's quiet defiance that morning, something different hung in the air. Even the light seemed to fall softer through the tall windows. Grace kept to herself after the confrontation. She no longer lingered near the nursery, no longer hummed while she worked. She finished her tasks and left without a word, careful not to give the millionaire any reason to notice her again. But Ethan noticed. The baby who had laughed and smiled for the first time in his short life now stared at the nursery door, waiting. His cries returned, sharper and more desperate each day. The new nannies the agency sent didn't last an hour before fleeing the room. By the end of the week, Alexander Cross was exhausted. The man who had once commanded boardrooms and crushed competitors with his words was powerless before his own child. His staff avoided him, his meetings went unattended, and every night, the house echoed with the same sorrowful wail that tore at his heart. On the 7th night, Alexander gave up trying to sleep. He stood outside the nursery door, leaning against the frame, eyes shadowed. Inside, Ethan screamed until his tiny voice cracked. And then Alexander did something he hadn't done in years, he prayed. Not aloud, but deep inside, to whatever might be listening. Please, just let him rest. Just one night. A soft voice answered, not from heaven, but from down the hall. Mr. Cross. Grace stood there, clutching her mop handle like a shield. Her eyes were full of worry, her uniform dusted with flour from the kitchen floor. I heard him crying, she whispered. Please, sir, let me help. Alexander hesitated, every part of him wanting to say no, to protect his pride, his order, his control. But then Ethan's scream turned into a desperate sob, and his heart cracked in two. He nodded once. Grace entered the room quietly. The moment Ethan saw her, his tears softened. She walked to the crib, humming that same melody, slow and low, the one she'd sung that first night. Ethan reached for her, and she lifted him without fear, holding him close to her chest. The room fell silent. Alexander stood in the doorway, frozen. For the first time in months, he heard nothing but his son's breathing. Grace swayed gently, her eyes half closed, whispering words he couldn't hear. Ethan's hand clutched her collar and then, within minutes, he was asleep. Grace looked up at Alexander, her voice trembling. He just needed to feel safe. Something shifted inside him again. The part of him that had been buried with Amelia stirred and reached for air. "Thank you," he said quietly. Grace smiled faintly. "He's a sweet boy. He just misses his mama." Alexander's jaw tightened, but his voice softened. "We all do." She didn't respond. She just rocked the child a moment longer before carefully laying him down. As she turned to leave, Alexander said, "Grace, wait." She stopped. The moonlight from the window traced her face in silver, soft and calm. "Why?" he asked. "Why do you care?" Her expression changed, not surprised, not offended, just thoughtful. "Because someone once cared for me when they didn't have to. I wouldn't be here otherwise." She turned to go, but Alexander's curiosity burned. He wasn't used to mysteries in his house. Everything he owned had a price and a purpose. But Grace, she didn't fit either. Over the next few days, he found excuses to see her. He asked questions about cleaning schedules, inventory lists, minor things he could have asked anyone else. Each time, she answered simply and disappeared before he could ask more. But every night, when Ethan cried, she came. And each time she did, he slept peacefully. The mansion staff began to whisper again. "The cleaner's got magic," they said. "She's the only one who can calm the boss's baby." Some thought Alexander had taken an interest in her, others that she'd bewitched the child. But the truth was simpler. Grace had the one thing no one else did, patience born from pain. One rainy afternoon, Alexander returned from a long day at his office. His driver dropped him at the gate, and he noticed something odd, Grace standing outside in the drizzle, talking to a man by the fence. The man's clothes were rough, his tone low and urgent. She handed him an envelope before quickly stepping back inside. Alexander said nothing that evening, but he watched her closely. She seemed distracted, her usual warmth dimmed by worry. When he approached her near the kitchen, she flinched slightly, as though caught doing something wrong. "Everything all right, Grace?" he asked. She forced a smile. "Yes, sir. Just tired." But Alexander's instincts, the same ones that built his empire, told him there was more. That night, after Grace left, he asked his head of security to follow the men she'd met at the fence. The next morning, a file landed on his desk. He opened it, expecting a simple report. What he read made him stop breathing. Grace Daniels was not who she said she was. Her real name was Grace Okoro. Before she came to Silver Hill, she'd worked as a nurse in a small community clinic downtown. She'd left her job abruptly 2 years earlier after taking responsibility for a medical mistake that hadn't been hers. The real culprit, a wealthy doctor, had let her bear the blame. The clinic shut down soon after, and Grace had vanished from record. The man she'd met outside was her brother, a mechanic struggling to pay for their mother's hospital bills. The envelope she'd handed over contained her week's wages. Alexander sat back, stunned. For years, he had judged people by their usefulness, their appearance, their perfection. Yet this woman, who mopped his floors, who had been accused and humiliated, still gave away what little she had, just to help her family. And she had healed his son. That night, he couldn't sleep. He walked through the mansion's halls, each footstep echoing with memories of how Amelia used to scold him for overworking, for closing his heart. He reached the nursery door and paused. Inside, Grace was there again, fast asleep beside the crib, Ethan's tiny hand resting on hers. Alexander stood there a long time, something breaking and mending inside him all at once. The next morning, he called her to his study. Grace entered nervously, clutching her cleaning cloth. "Did I do something wrong, sir?" He shook his head. "No. But I know who you are." Her face paled. "Please." He raised a hand. "It's all right. I read your file. And I owe you an apology. Her eyes widened in confusion. I've spent my whole life surrounded by people who lie to impress me, he said. You're the first person I've met who told the truth through your actions, not your words. Grace blinked back tears. Sir, I didn't mean to deceive you. I just needed work. For my mother. I know, Alexander said softly. And you'll have it. Not as a cleaner. As Ethan's caretaker. Permanently. Her hands trembled. I don't know what to say. Say yes, he replied, smiling faintly. He needs you. And maybe, so do I. Grace looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for any hint of pride or pity. But she found none, only sincerity. Finally, she nodded. Yes, sir. I'll stay. As she turned to leave, Ethan crawled to the doorway, laughing. Alexander bent down, scooped up his son, and for the first time, the boy didn't resist. Grace watched them together, the father learning to love again, the son finally feeling safe, and she whispered to herself, "Thank you, God." The world outside the mansion began to whisper before Alexander ever noticed. A billionaire's baby, come again after months of chaos, had become the talk of the staff agencies. No one knew why, until one of the dismissed nannies told a friend, who told a journalist, that the new caretaker wasn't a professional at all. She was just a cleaner. Within days, cameras appeared at the iron gates of Silver Hill. Inside, Grace felt the storm coming long before it hit. She could sense it in the way the gardeners stopped talking when she passed, in the sudden hush that fell when she entered the servants' hall. Even the driver, normally cheerful, avoided her eyes. That evening, she asked Alexander quietly, "Is something wrong, sir?" He looked up from his laptop, weary. "People have found out about you. About us. They're asking questions." "Us," she echoed. "I mean Ethan and you," he said quickly, though his voice carried a tremor that told her there was more behind the word. "They think it's inappropriate. That I've lost my judgment." Grace lowered her gaze. "Then maybe I should leave." "No," he said at once, sharper than intended. "You can't." "Ethan," he stopped, rubbing his temples. "You're the only one he trusts." She hesitated, then nodded. "All right. But if they come for me, don't defend me. Protect your son first." He looked at her for a long moment, realizing how different she was from everyone he'd ever known. No greed. No ambition. Only sincerity. 2 days later, the headlines came. Millionaire's child cared for by ex-nurse with tainted record. It spread fast. Online, strangers debated whether Alexander had lost his mind or his heart. Some defended Grace, others mocked her. Reporters waited outside the mansion, cameras flashing whenever a shadow crossed a window. Alexander tried to shield Grace from the noise, but she saw the articles anyway. Every word reopened the wound she had tried to forget, the mistake she hadn't made, the blame she had carried alone. That night, when she tucked Ethan into bed, she whispered, "You're too little to understand, my love. But the world isn't kind to people like us. We forgive, and they still throw stones." Ethan's tiny fingers reached for her face, and she smiled through her tears. Downstairs, Alexander watched the security feed showing reporters at the gate. He clenched his fists. For years he had thrived on attention, but now he hated it. Because this time, it hurt someone who didn't deserve it. He made a decision. Tomorrow, he would speak publicly, defend her, tell the truth. That night, the storm came. Lightning split the sky above Silver Hill. The wind howled through the open corridors, rattling the chandeliers. At midnight, a thunderclap shook the building, and somewhere deep in the walls, an old wire sparked. Grace smelled the smoke first. She was on her way to the laundry when a faint burning scent drifted through the hallway. She froze, sniffed again, then dropped her basket and ran toward the nursery. When she opened the door, orange light licked the ceiling. A curtain near the crib had caught fire. "Ethan," she cried. The child was awake, eyes wide with terror. Flames crawled up the drapes. Without thinking, Grace grabbed a blanket, wrapped it around him, and held him close. The smoke stung her eyes as she kicked the door open and ran into the hall. "Fire," she shouted. "Help!" Alarms began to blare. Servants poured from their rooms, shouting, but the smoke spread faster than anyone expected. Grace covered Ethan's face with the blanket and sprinted down the grand staircase. Halfway down, a beam cracked above her. "Grace," a voice roared. Alexander was running up toward her through the haze. "Give him to me." She hesitated, then handed Ethan over and turned back toward the nursery. "There's another child in the wing," she lied, knowing full well there wasn't. She just didn't want him to see the flames closing in behind her. "Grace, no." Alexander shouted, but she had already disappeared into the smoke. Moments later, the roof over the nursery collapsed. Alexander stumbled out into the rain, clutching his son, screaming her name. Firefighters arrived, drenching the mansion in foam and water. When they finally found her, she was unconscious but alive, trapped under a fallen beam. He rode with her in the ambulance, refusing to leave her side. When Grace woke hours later in the hospital, her first words were, "Is Ethan safe?" Alexander took her hand. "He's fine. Because of you." She smiled weakly. "Then that's all that matters." He shook his head. "No. What matters now is that you know you're not alone anymore." Grace looked into his eyes and saw it, the thing she never expected to find again. Respect. Gratitude. Something deeper she didn't dare name. Outside her room, reporters still shouted questions. But Alexander didn't care. For the first time, he saw clearly who the real hero was. Months passed. Silver Hill no longer glittered the way it used to. The mansion's walls were patched but scarred, its grand chandelier gone, its owner quieter than ever. The press had finally moved on to new scandals, new names, but the damage lingered in whispers. Alexander Cross had rebuilt empires before, but this was different. His company's board demanded distance from the controversy. His investors had threatened to walk. He could have smoothed it over easily, fire Grace, issue a statement, restore his spotless image. But he hadn't. Instead, he had stood before the cameras and said words no one expected from a man like him. "If caring for my child and the woman who saved his life costs me money or reputation, then I welcome the loss. Because some things are worth more than both." The world didn't forgive easily, but it listened. Grace, however, had disappeared from the mansion. She had left quietly after recovering, leaving behind nothing but a note, "Thank you for letting me care for him. Take care of yourself, too." Alexander read that note every night. Ethan, now toddling and talking in his small voice, called for her every morning. "Mama Grace," he would ask, clutching his teddy bear. Each time, Alexander's heart broke a little more. One cold morning, as snow dusted the city, Alexander drove alone into the poorer district, streets he had once looked down on from his mansion's windows. He parked outside a small community clinic, half collapsed but still open. On the door, painted by hand, were the words, "Grace Outreach Center, free care for all." Inside, he found her. Grace stood behind a counter, wearing a faded white coat, her hair tied back, gently tending to an elderly woman's hand. Her eyes lifted when she heard the bell. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "You found me," she said quietly. "I wasn't looking for you," he lied softly. Ethan was. Her lips curved faintly. "How is he?" "Walking. Talking. He still asks for you every day." Grace's eyes glistened, but she turned away. "He doesn't need me anymore. He has you." Alexander shook his head. "He needs both of us. And maybe, so do I." She froze, then sighed. "You have a world to run, Alexander. And I have one to heal." "You built this place?" he asked, looking around. She nodded. "With the settlement money you sent after the fire. I didn't use it for myself. I wanted to give others what I lost, a second chance." He smiled faintly. "You could have used it to live comfortably. You didn't." "I don't need comfort," she said simply. "I need purpose." For the first time, he understood what that meant. For years, he'd chased success believing it would fill the hollow inside him. But standing there, in that little clinic, he saw that she had found what he'd been searching for all along. When Grace stepped outside later that evening, the snow had begun to fall heavier. Alexander was still there, leaning against his car, holding Ethan, wrapped in a blue coat too big for him. The boy squealed when he saw her, reaching out with both arms. "Grace," he cried. She caught him, tears slipping down her cheeks as he buried his face in her shoulder. For a long moment, the three of them stood there, silent except for the wind. "I don't have much to offer," Alexander said softly. "But if you'll come back, no, if you'll let me come here, we can start over. Not as boss and employee. As family." Grace stared at him, unsure if she'd heard right. "Family?" He nodded. "Amelia once told me love doesn't belong in mansions, it lives where hearts are honest. She was right. And I think she'd want me to find peace where it truly belongs." Grace looked down at Ethan, who had already fallen asleep in her arms. Then she looked back up, her voice trembling. "Are you sure you're ready for that kind of life, Alexander Cross?" He smiled. "For the first time in years, I'm sure of something." Months later, Silver Hill was no longer a palace. It had become a home. The marble floors were replaced with wooden ones that carried warmth instead of echoes. The chandeliers were gone, but laughter filled the halls again. Grace still worked part-time at her clinic. Alexander joined her there on weekends, helping file records or carry supplies. And Ethan, bright, joyful Ethan, grew into the kind of child people smiled at instead of feared. One evening, as the sun set through the wide kitchen windows, Alexander found Grace standing by the counter, humming softly while Ethan colored at her feet. "Do you ever miss the old days?" he asked. She looked around at the cluttered dishes, the noise, the warmth. "Not for a second." He nodded. "Neither do I." Then, almost shyly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "Grace. I've been a man who thought he had everything. But it turns out, I didn't have anything until you walked into that nursery." Grace's breath caught as he opened the box. Inside was a simple gold ring. "I'm not offering perfection," he said quietly. "Just honesty. And a promise to never forget the woman who taught me what love looks like." Tears welled in her eyes. She nodded once, unable to speak. Ethan clapped his tiny hands. "Yay. Mama Grace happy." They both laughed, and in that laughter, the mansion truly became a home. Epilogue. Years later, when people spoke of Alexander Cross, they didn't call him the millionaire anymore. They called him the man who rebuilt lives. His wealth didn't come from stocks or steel anymore, it came from compassion, from the small clinic that kept growing, from the people who believed that even the hardest hearts could change. And in the nursery that once echoed with screams, a new lullaby filled the air, a song Grace used to hum on lonely nights, now sung softly to their daughter. Love, it turned out, didn't need permission. Years had passed since the fire, the rumors, and the storms that had once haunted Silver Hill. The mansion no longer stood as a symbol of wealth, but as a home, a place where laughter filled every corner and warmth replaced the cold echoes of marble floors. Alexander Cross, once a man consumed by ambition, had learned what money could never buy: peace, forgiveness, and the joy of giving. Grace Daniels had transformed her quiet courage into a life mission. The small clinic she had opened after leaving the mansion had grown into a community center for children and families in need. Every child who arrived found a safe place, a warm meal, and someone who believed in them. And every time she thought of Ethan, she remembered the tiny boy whose small hands had clutched her sleeve and taught her how even a little love could change everything. Ethan, now 10 years old, bounded through the snow-covered yard with a bundle of papers in his hands. He had inherited neither his father's sharp business mind nor his mother's gentle humility, yet he had something far more precious, a heart wide enough to love everyone he met. "Mom! Dad!" he shouted, racing toward the two of them who were walking through the crisp winter air. "Look what I made at school. A plan for a charity, just like the clinic." Grace knelt, taking the papers from him. "Let me see, my little visionary." She smiled, brushing snowflakes from his hair. Alexander watched, his chest swelling with pride and awe. He had once thought that controlling the world meant strength, now he knew that true strength meant nurturing hearts. Alexander knelt beside them. "Tell me about it, Ethan. I want to hear every idea." Ethan's excitement was contagious. "We'll help kids who don't have homes, and teach them to read, and give them art classes, and and we'll make sure no child feels alone like I once did." Grace and Alexander exchanged a look. Words weren't enough to capture the quiet miracle they had witnessed over the years. A baby who once lashed out at the world had grown into a boy who wanted to save it. That evening, the family gathered around the fireplace. Ethan was asleep, wrapped in a blanket that Grace had sewn herself, Alexander by her side. The room smelled of pine and wood smoke. Outside, the first stars of the winter sky twinkled like a promise. Grace looked at Alexander, her eyes reflecting both the firelight and years of shared struggles. "Do you ever think about the old mansion?" she asked softly. "Sometimes," Alexander admitted. "But it feels like a different life now. One I don't need anymore." Grace nodded. "It's strange, isn't it? How everything fell apart, but somehow, it led us here." Alexander reached for her hand, holding it tightly. "I've learned something important," he said. "It's not about wealth, power, or reputation. It's about love. And the people willing to give it, even when no one else believes in them." Grace smiled, her heart full. "Then I guess the real mansion isn't made of marble or gold," she said. "It's made of people who care for each other." Alexander leaned forward and kissed her gently. "Then we'll keep building it, every day, with Ethan and anyone else who needs it." The next morning, Grace and Alexander arrived at the clinic together. Children ran to greet them, holding hands and offering hugs. Volunteers waved, grateful for the support the couple provided. A sign hung over the entrance. "The Crossocorro Center, where love builds futures." Alexander looked around at the smiling faces, families, children, and staff alike, and felt something he had never felt in all his years of wealth: complete fulfillment. Grace squeezed his hand. "Do you think we're making a difference?" Alexander smiled. "We already have. Look around." Ethan ran past them, carrying a small box of paints. "Mom. Dad. I'm going to paint everyone a picture today." As he ran, Alexander and Grace shared a quiet laugh. The past, the loss, the fear, the pain, was still there, but it had been transformed. What once was broken had become whole again, stronger and brighter. That night, as they tucked Ethan into bed, Grace whispered, "You've grown so much, my brave little boy." Ethan hugged her tightly. "I want to help everyone be happy, Mom. Just like you helped me." Alexander stood in the doorway, smiling. "And we'll help you, son. Every step of the way." Grace looked around the quiet home, feeling warmth radiate through her chest. She realized that life's true fortune was never counted in money. It was measured in hearts touched, in children protected, in love shared without expectation. Outside, the snow fell softly, blanketing the city in quiet peace. The Crossocorro family, once shaped by tragedy, now walked forward with hope, purpose, and unbreakable bonds. And in every laugh, every hug, every whispered word of kindness, the legacy of love endured, stronger than any fortune, brighter than any star. If this story of love, redemption, and family inspired you, hit the subscribe button and join us for more tales that warm your heart and restore your faith in humanity.